Thank you very much to Aparna and to Warwick Debating Union for inviting me to give a talk about this exciting topic. There is no doubt that China will be a dominant power in the 21st century, no doubt. And I can argue this case from three perspectives. Economic perspective, and perspective in relation to Sino-US relations, and perspective in relation to China's foreign policy in international institutions such as the United Nations. First of all, I choose economic reason because this is a reason that many of you probably know. China is the second biggest economy on earth. And various economists argue that China will surpass its GDP over that of the US by, for example, 2019. This is the economist talking, and other more pessimistic scholars actually say that China will surpass the US economically by 2030. In fact, yesterday we had a report that China just overtook the United States officially. And what I mean by this is that this is an IMF report, official report, that the way you can count the economic power is not only by GDP, but also by what's called purchasing power. This is the purchasing power is the excuse me, just adjusting microphone. Purchasing power means that the currency rate is so different. So if you just simply translating the renminbi, the Chinese currency, to the US, then you can never get the correct picture of how each country, how much economic power each country has. So they have a particular measure to count the purchasing power of each country. And according to that purchasing power, China actually is overtaking the US right now. And this is the IMF's official report. Some might say that China's economic growth is not as rapidly developing as in the past. Currently, it's maintaining about 7% of economic growth annually, rather than double-digit, more than 10% that China was achieving in the past. But still, if you compare that with the United States, which is about 3% rise annually, there is no question about the prospect of China's economic supremacy in the 21st century. Also, the fact that China is lending about, or holding about 8% of the stock of US treasuries, this must mean something. All those things will indicate that China's economic supremacy is already there. It's no longer the question of will China be a dominant power. China is economically a dominant power now. So this is the first point I want to say from an economic point of view, which many of you would probably know that China is a strong economic power. Sorry, I'm embarrassing myself. I didn't realize there was this note was showing. You might know what I'm going to talk about now. Okay, so the second point I wanted to say is in relation to Sino-US relations. What China is trying to do at the moment is China is currently trying to constrain the US hegemony, because what China needs to do now is to try to secure the peaceful environment in which China can develop economically. And this is absolutely important for the Chinese Communist Party, for its regime stability and regime survival. The key thing for the Chinese Communist Party is to maintain its regime legitimacy and stability, for which economic power is absolutely essential. Chinese people are very happy at the moment. Majority of them are happy because of the economic success that China has. So China is trying to constrain the US power at the moment to create sort of a peaceful environment in which China can develop economically further. But then once you surpass the US even further, that's the time China tried to gain hegemony. And one of the myths that I want to invite your attention to is that some people are thinking that China will wage war against the United States. And with the recent example of Senkaku-Diaoyu Island dispute, many people, including those in Japan and China, are kind of forecasting that China might wage wars in the future. But that's not necessarily the case. China can still maintain, achieve the dominance, not by military means, but by economic and political means. And the reason is exactly what I just said before, which is that China needs to maintain its economic growth. For that, war is not necessary. War is a disturbance to China's economic growth. So China will try to achieve dominance by diplomatic and economic means, but not by military means. That's my second point. China will try to achieve dominance, but not necessarily by military means. The third point, this is not really well known. The third point is in relation to China's diplomacy at the United Nations. China will also become a dominant power in the United Nations and other international institutions. But the debate is more about how China will achieve that rather than whether China will achieve dominance. The dominance is already there, already established. There are many myths about how China will become dominant. One of the examples of discussion is that China will change the current liberal world order completely. And this is not really true. This is a really sensationalized idea of how China relates to international institutions. What China is doing at the moment, there are three key points about China's behavior in international institutions. And all those 3 points will suggest that China will achieve dominance in international institutions. First point, China is actually substantially contributing to multilateral institutions. One of the examples I can tell you is that UN peacekeeping. China is the biggest contributor to UN peacekeeping amongst P5, permanent 5 members. That's one of the examples. And also, secondly, China is getting integrated into the current international liberal order rather than trying to change it. The example of this is that China contributes to peacekeeping, for example, but China is trying to push forward the agenda of development in relation to security. So the way China is thinking is this. Security should be achieved if the development is achieved. People fight because there is poverty. People fight because there is no prospect for economic growth in the future. So by developing economically, people can achieve peace. That's generally what the line of Chinese thinking. So rather than focusing on human security, human development, and human rights, which the Western power tends to focus on, China is focusing on development. And so what China is doing is getting integrated into the current liberal order, but trying to reform what the international institutions are doing. Also, thirdly, I should invite your attention to the fact that China is overly popular from other developing countries. I traveled to Liberia, Aceh, Cambodia, some of the developing countries, and interviewed local people while they think about Chinese power. Very, very popular. Very different kind of perspective from what we hear in everyday media context. What China is doing is kind of trying to bridge between the developing power, who is not really represented in international institutions, and also the great power, because China regards itself as the leader of the developing world. By these 3 means, together with China's dominant economic and military power, China will establish dominance in the 21st century, and there is no doubt about it. I'll leave my talk to there. Thank you.
You won't be surprised that I'm going to disagree. You do so in gentlemanly fashion there. Writing, talking, thinking about China is has become quite difficult these days because there tends to be a Manichaean divide on China. Either you say that China will rule the world, will dominate the 21st century, or, on the other hand, people say China is bound to collapse. Its system is such that it cannot keep going economically, politically, socially, and is bound to, as one American investor put it, find itself on a treadmill to hell. The trouble is that if you're in the middle of these two, as I am, you tend to be seen as a rather wishy-washy, milquetoast kind of sitting on the fence person. In fact, my last book, but one of the reviewers in the Times attacked me for sitting on the fence and not saying that China would either collapse or rule the world. But that was precisely the point of the book. And in taking that position, saying that I don't believe China will dominate the 21st century, I'm in no way saying that China will collapse or that China isn't going to be a very, very important player in the world. Indeed, its emergence over the last 35 years is the most important single global event since the end of the Cold War. And I think that will continue. Growth may fall off, it may get out to 6.5, 6%, but still, that's not bad. And I don't see any alternative politically to the Communist Party. So I just want to make that clear that in arguing that China will not dominate the 21st century, I'm not in any way saying that China is done for. It's contrary. It'll be up there with the United States, with Europe, if Europe gets attacked together ever, as one of the big players in the world. I'm not making an anti-Nigel Farage joke. That is a question. Also to make one other point, I think if we could speak to the question, to the motion. The motion is, as it was sent to me, that this House believes that China will be the dominant power in the 21st century. Not a dominant power, but that it will dominate the world. And that is what, basically, I don't agree with. First of all, I don't think any single country can dominate the world. We live in a multipolar world where, as we can see, the most powerful state on earth, the United States, has a lot of difficulty with a war, for instance, in Afghanistan, which you might have thought the dominant power in the world would be able to deal with quite easily. But the nature of the world, the nature of international relations is such that I don't think any power can be the dominant power. Secondly, I don't think China wants to be the dominant power in the world. You can take the economy, indeed, as the proposer pointed out, in PPP terms, according to the IMF, China has now overtaken America. Well, that's a statistic that was going to happen anyway. When you've got 1.3 billion people, compared with what 250 in the United States, of course you just do the maths. It's like all the superlatives on China are enormous simply because of the number of people and the size of China. But I don't think China wants to dominate the world, and even when it was at its previous height of economic power, around 1800, when, according to calculations, it accounted for about 1/3 of global wealth. That's more than anybody could possibly have these days. At that point, it didn't dominate the world. It had no domination over the Americas, over Europe, over Africa, over Latin America, or over Asia west of the border with India. So drawing the link between economic power or economic numbers as a big GDP number stemming from the size of China and the enormous catch-up which is done over the last 35 years doesn't equate into domination. And I think there are a series of factors which, since time is limited, I will go through in very headline fashion, but we could debate later on, why China will not achieve this dominant position, which is sometimes laid out for it. First of all, China is still quite poor, relatively. Go to Beijing, Shanghai on a Saturday night, and it makes Coventry look like the backwoods. Or even Oxford Street there. But go out an hour's drive from Beijing, and you're still in pretty poor, backward countryside. Go into Sichuan in the west, visit workshops there, and these are not the humming great assembly shops of Guangdong province in the south. They are a lot of unmechanized, metal-bashing labor production, which dates back to the 1920s. China, that's the first point. Second point, China is very resource dependent. It has 21% of the world's population and about 7% of the world's arable land. It has to import everything. It's even become a net rice importer recently. It has to import iron ore, copper, everything else to make its manufacturing machines work. And it is suffering from a real water crisis in northern China, where the aquifers are drying up. You have to drill down to water. I don't know how you date water, but the latest water brought up in Beijing is 30,000 years old. It's going so deep. There's a huge water crisis in exactly the wheatlands where the grain is grown in China. The economy needs a transition. The previous Prime Minister, Wen Jiabao, famously said the four uns, I can never remember all of them, that the economy is unbalanced, unsustainable, something else, and something else. You remember the job. There were the three uns. Yeah. We got a reform. Last November, the Communist Party plenum drew up a list of no fewer than 60 reforms which had to be done in China. So there's a huge rebalancing to be done away from dependence on build more motorways, build more infrastructure, and towards consumption. But that is happening very slowly indeed. The system makes it difficult to change, and while China has indeed got $4.3 trillion worth of national reserves, currency reserves, about half of it probably in dollar securities in the US, it can't sell them. It's stuck. It's in the classic case which Keynes said, if you owe your banker $100, you have a problem. If you owe him $1 million, he's got a problem. And the problem is that China can't start to sell or use these reserves in any fruitful manner because they are frozen in China, and if they started to sell them, the bottom will fall out in dollar and the rest would be worth practically nothing. There are huge quality of life, if you like, and social issues in China, some of which you'll, I'm sure, be familiar with: air, water and soil pollution, food safety, lack of trust in the authorities, lack of a legal system, the whole question of the second generation middle class, the migrant workers who work in cities but have no rights in those cities, all these social problems which have to be dealt with and which the authorities know that is their first, if they're going to stay in power, that's their first problem. There's a lack of innovation. China puts together a lot of things. Look at your iPhone. It would have been put together in Shenzhen, but China only keeps 6% of the sale price of the iPhone. So it's doing a lot for the rest of the world, but it's not had much innovation itself. It still hasn't launched an airline, which it's been trying to do for the last 10 years. Militarily, although we see headlines, particularly around the time of hectagon budget discussions, about China's growing military power, it's still way behind the United States. It can do asymmetrical warfare, but it's got one aircraft carrier, which it bought from the Ukraine, fairly clapped out old vessel and so on, which is renovated, but its military power is not that great. Chinese soft power, China spent a lot of money on soft power, Confucius Institutes, etc., etc., etc. And of course, that has spread knowledge of Chinese culture, which is an entirely good thing, and the language. But go to a city in China, and you'll find more signs of westernization than you would find signs of Chinese influence in, say, Coventry or Birmingham there. And as for political power, I say perhaps controversially, you see people demonstrating, rightly or wrongly, for Western-style democracy in Ukraine, in the Arab world, elsewhere. I have never seen anybody marching in the streets in favour of installing a Chinese political system. I know Mr. Help. China doesn't have allies. There's one ally in the world, treaty ally, and that's North Korea. It deals with all its foreign relations on a bilateral basis, and in Southeast Asia it's achieved the feat of frightening countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, so they've gone back further under the American military umbrella. You've got the US presence with a superior military force based in Yokohama in the south of Japan, going through Taiwan down to the Philippines, which inhibits China. I understand, you know, they feel enclosed. Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, said to Obama when they met in California, the Pacific is good enough for both of us, big enough for both of us. But that means America going back to Guam and Hawaii, which they're not going to do in a hurry. So there are all these problems there, and I would say underlying all this is the basic political problem, that we have a one-party state whose main bottom line is preserving its own power. Have I finished the too long? No. I like that. Which is preserving its own power. And everything is subject to that. And perhaps you'll write me off as an old-fashioned Western liberal Democrat, but I think that one-party states, in the end, find it very, very difficult First of all, to maintain the kind of growth which you need organically if China is to move to the next stage of economic development, which it certainly needs to do, which you need if you're going to make friends and have international influence. And despite what the previous speaker said, China's influence on international bodies is tiny. When does it come up with any initiatives at the IMF, the World Bank, or the United Nations? No, it is not a responsible stakeholder. It doesn't want to be, it doesn't need to be, because it is sufficiently large into itself. And that is perfectly coherent way of looking at your world role, but it certainly means you won't be the dominant power of the 21st century. Thank you.
Okay, I'm inclined to agree with a lot of what we just heard, but I think that what we take from it at the end just slightly off. So I agree that China is reluctant to be a dominant power. It's not sure it really has a choice, that the economic realities of the world we live in make it a dominant power, whether or not it wants to be. It does not actively want to rule the world, we concede, but it passively does so regardless. Before I go on to my speech, I just want to thank Hirono. She's done an amazing job. Many moons ago, I was involved in running Warwick Debating Union. It's exceptionally hard to put together something like this. And she should, and her team should all be really proud of themselves. And going on to my speech, and look at three ways in which we traditionally look at people projecting power. So look at the economy, looking at the military, and looking at sort of cultural factors, how much value we should give to these different ways of projecting power, and how able China has been, and how willing China is to do it. So moving on to the economy, the question is not whether China will become the world's biggest economy. It's when it will become it. I mean, 2019 to 2030, the data we heard earlier, that it will happen. And we get quite rightly before lots of examples the challenges China's economy faces. And I mean, it is not set up perfectly. It is the case that it does have to rebalance to a consumer base. It does have to move up the value chain of the goods it exports. But these are solvable problems. I think it's not just possible, but probable that ways will be found around that the economy will be maintained. I think it is premature to suggest that there's some sort of Sino crash about to happen. But then the question becomes, how does it translate this economic power into soft power? What does that mean? Because as was quite rightly pointed out before, in 1800 China did have a third of the world's GDP, but it was not a dominant power on the global stage, but it's different now. Firstly, purchasing power means soft power in a way it didn't back then. We now live in a globalized economy in a way which we didn't in 1800. It is the case, as was pointed out, that the iPhone in my left-hand pocket at the moment has travelled through lots of different countries in the world, the parts of it, in order to arrive here today. And that having more purchasing power and more in that market is more power to invest and to purchase goods, and more influence over what it produces, how it produces, and the way actors act within it. That certainly is some soft power. Secondly, that it purchases large amounts of debt worldwide in a way which wasn't true in 1800. The sovereign debt crisis in Europe is affecting us all, and part of that meant that China bought lots of European sovereign debt. Now it does that for economic, not political reasons. I don't think there are political intentions behind those purchases. But even so, there are political implications of China holding large amounts of European debt. It does mean soft power in Europe, but it does also raise the status of its currency, one which may well never truly rival the dollar as the world's reserve currency, but can certainly have become the world's second reserve currency, become an alternative. And also, finally talking about the economy, it now gives more aid in Africa than the World Bank does. Again, I don't think these are political decisions that the Chinese leadership are making when they're doing this, right? But it does advantage Chinese culture and its status in the world and the way it's viewed. And although, again, has been pointed out correctly, China's rise has in general seen it increasingly wanting to integrate itself within the current international institutions, playing more of a role in the United Nations, spending more money on the UN peacekeeping forces, etc. There are some international institutions it doesn't particularly support. It is not a very active member of the IMF and the World Bank, precisely because there are outdated systems by which they are run. it is frankly ridiculous that it's the case that one of them is always run by a European and one of them is always run by an American. That's not the world we live in anymore. And it's right for China to not play an active role in that. And although I don't think this is the aim of China's investing in Africa, it certainly does have a side response of diminishing the importance of those pre-existing institutions, right? The World Bank is no longer the main lender in Africa. It no longer can have the same role on the world stage, and it's caused it to reform. So I think economically it does have some soft power from its position, which does make it dominant, even if none of the decisions that are making are political in nature. Then go on to look at the military, and firstly, again, I don't think the military is particularly important to this debate. I don't see China waging particularly a hot war against America. I think it is quite an absurdist notion. But when we focus on what matters with the military, China actually does match America in many ways. It is a nuclear power, if that's something you care about. And if it were to come to some large war, its population is very large for that. But more importantly, yes, America spends a lot more, right? We'll concede. I'm not going to be able to argue the opposite. However, we need to talk about what that means. So the biggest expenditure in the American military is not its big aircraft carriers, it's not its fighter planes, it's not its sophisticated technical equipment. It's its pensions program, right? That is what the biggest piece of American military expenditure is, pensions, right? It's not the case that base spending on military equates to ability to then project that military force. The American military-industrial complex, which was laughed about by the previous speaker quite rightly, means that military companies are very good at lobbying for more money to be spent on the military. They buy lots of stuff that they don't need, and when they buy it, they tend to overpay by a large amount. When we focus on what actually matters, China has the largest army in Asia, and it is spending a lot more on its navy to get it out of shape. Right? It's the case that Chinese spending on its navy to project power in the South China Sea, the only area where its military power might matter, is increasing massively, and it is able to match. So I think that it's not the obvious sort of win to America, or whatever you want to call it, on the military side. And then finally, talking culturally, the first thing to note when we're talking culturally is that it's policy of non-intervention, of not wanting to lead the world in such an active way as the British did in its century, the 19th century, or the Americans in its century, the 20th one, means that it's more popular. If you go to the kind of places where it's involved, it's not trying to impose its own values and systems, it's more able to win support. Chatham House release surveys every year, surveys every year on the way in which people around the world perceive different nations. And China consistently has been improving its position due to the fact it does not aim to micromanage the actions of others. And secondly, we need to know that it is also taking actions culturally to spread its culture. Look at, for instance, the Confucius Institutes worldwide. It's a program which only started in 2004, and now there are 500 worldwide that are planned to be 1,000 of these bodies by 2020. What they are is they are institutions which, much like the British Institute, work with educational bodies abroad to make increase access to Chinese language, history and culture, and have been incredibly successful so far. The Ministry of Education in China predicted in 2010 that over 100 million people outside of China that year were learning Chinese. Not spoke Chinese, but were in the process of learning it. And we have every reason to believe that number is much higher as we speak today. Linked with their globally sort of increasing economic power, produces a fortuitous cycle where we think at the moment we may well live in a world where English is predominant and English culture is predominant, but it's very difficult actually to project that with certainty going forward. Know that living in, by definitionally, an English-speaking nation of England, we can sometimes take a Western-centric view and not think about how different cultures are interacting and gaining prominence all over the rest of the world. So to end my speech, I want to say also that ambitions do to some extent exist, partially contradicting what I said earlier. Confucius Institutes are examples of wanting to get some sort of power abroad. General Secretary Xi Jinping has coined the phrase the Chinese dream. And this is mainly a domestic notion, mainly an internal one, about the opportunities available to individual Chinese citizens. But it is also about more than that. It's about China taking its rightful place at the world's top table, about being one of the main powers. But this is not a world power in the way in which we've seen it before. We need to abandon our preconceptions which we have created because the world powers we have experienced in our lifetimes previously, and the world powers of the cultures we belong to. But the world power and the dominant world power is one which is an interventionist one, tries to manage and project itself on other countries. Non-interventionism and peace are fundamental to the Chinese foreign policy and the way in which it sees itself in the world. And China will dominate regardless of a choice. So I urge you to propose.
Can I congratulate the committee, or whoever thought of this in the first place, for establishing a lively debating tradition. Travelling in places like China, I've often urged them to think of this as a way of giving young people a better crack at life. Certainly, in other British campuses I've been on, I have urged this ferociously because it's a double your salary to be able to stand on your feet and defend the case in clear language. That's putting it rather. I'm in a slight difficulty here. I mean, I agree almost by definition with Jonathan, and nobody specifically commended his wonderful book, his latest, which I certainly enjoyed vastly, and I found it difficult to... Oh, there we are. Yes, now, have you got a supply?
No, I've only got one, but available at all the bookshops. Online, Amazon, half price.
I also have a difficulty that I, of course, was posted twice to China, but I was also posted to Japan, and I want to tell our fellow speaker that I love them both. That is the wettest of Foreign Office positions. Well, I agree fundamentally with the point that with dealing with China, as Jonathan said, you can't be absolutely sure that the heaven on earth case or the hell on earth case is going to prevail. I also sit happily on the fence and think that this country has enormous interest in both, as well as in the Asian region as a whole. I'm more inclined to some than some to sentiment of optimism about China's future. That the man who got it just dead right about thinking about Chinese future was one of our previous ambassadors in Beijing, and he said we always have to remember about China that anything can happen, and that would apply to the two devised, including the shift of action towards the West and a bigger role in the market and more encouragement of consumption. That seems to be a pretty sound approach. Where I differ from Jonathan is in having a slight feeling that the game is not completely dead on political change. What is certainly true in Chinese history at all times is the man at the top. This was a model so admired in the 18th century in Britain. How does this one man at the top hold together these vast numbers in such a relatively stable way? Well, it strikes me, having been there to see Mao in action and Deng in action, hoping at some point to see the individual character of the man at the top is still a very, very important aspect of taking a view of China. I don't know if there are any residual supporters of Maoism in the room, but I beg to differ. My first posting took me there just on the eve and in the early phases of the Cultural Revolution, and it was brutal, it was wrong in China, and it was hell for the citizens. And nothing will shift me from that view. In my second tour, I saw the re-emergence of Deng, who took China onto what has turned out to be absolutely the right track. this was not inevitable. These things are fought over. And in recent years, leading up to the arrival of Xi Jinping, there have been plenty of evidence of hot disagreements at the top about the right course to take, economically and to some extent politically. You will remember Wenjiabao's speech, in which he said, in essence, that if we don't go forward, we will go back, and we will find ourselves in a cultural revolution again. That was at least the implication. That speech was not terribly popular in China itself. I think it was underestimated in the West, but it suggests to me that there's an ongoing debate, if you like, or discussion of the right course for China. And it's not surprising, is it, given the things that were inflicted on China, 5 minutes rights, things that were inflicted on China in the 19th century, as have been mentioned. It produces a set of reactions which I don't think you can characterize as aggressive. I don't think China is gearing up for aggressive war on Western interests. You always have to remember with the Chinese that they are concerned about the loss of territory, loss of status, loss of ability to influence anything really in the 19th century. And that persists as a kind of background consciousness. Looking ahead, you can work out what China needs and to some extent where China is likely to head. I'm not sure it's so easy to be sure of your ground when you're suggesting what we want out of China. Now, I have a strong affection for the concept of engaging China in the solution of the problems, the big problems, which can't be solved without her participation. We heard about water, that doesn't apply to China alone. We heard about didn't hear about climate change and pollution, need for collective action, certainly in managing world money supply. These are all things in which the West hopes or should hope to engage China and should make a very strong effort to do so. Looking more parochially at Britain, one can see areas in which we need China, or the other way around, should make a particular effort ourselves to engage China. One that speaks to me as it spoke to Deng Xiaoping when he returned to a position of authority was to speed innovation, to restore scientists in China to the position they should have held, to cooperate with the UK in developing new scientific systems and projects. But they seem to be up for that. Putting on for 1 second, my Ale House hat, we're trying to work up a dialogue in aspects of new energy systems with the Chinese. There are broader dialogues between the government here and China on such topics, but we can do something that's focused with people who are able at the Chinese end and who are interested in our ideas. The Royal Society recently held a seminar which all of us looked at what to do to reinforce her links with Chinese science or reinforce her reputation in Chinese science. And it emerged that we are now, we've overtaken Japan. We are the second biggest of the Americans in doing joint projects and publishing them. The general opinion of the quality of Chinese scientific research has shot up. In my first tour in Beijing, we used to mock the Maoists for claiming to be able to do surgery without anesthetics, for claiming to have found magic ways to produce insulin. as a perception, Chinese science seems a contradiction in terms. That is no longer the truth. And I was very struck hearing these Royal Society cats express genuine enthusiasm for the quality now of Chinese science. I think it is very much to our advantage to cooperate in these soft power areas, if you like. I think you said, or were going to say, Jonathan, that there are far more people in China learning English than people learning Chinese in the outer world. Nevertheless, I mean, that's true and that's a great thing. I don't think that will come to an early end. But it's very much to our advantage if we can enhance the necessary skills for dealing with China. That, of course, includes the language. It includes attitudes, matching something that hasn't been mentioned, the genuine robustness and enthusiasm of the next generation in China. I was amazed during the Cultural Revolution and before, seeing what the Chinese would put up with. Yes, I wanted to give you, if I can find it, one quotation. Yeah, this is the view of the man, one of the men who accompanied Paul McCartney when he went unsuccessfully to China in the 1790s. China is the grandest collective object that can be presented for human contemplation and research. China was fascinating then, and for me anyway, it's fascinating now. And I don't think you have to assume global domination to take that position. Thanks very much.
Oh, yeah, okay. So I think to summarize, the statement of China being a dominant world power sounds like quite a big one. When I was asked to speak, I felt that was quite a radical, big thing I had to propose. But I'm not, having sort of read and thought about it more, I'm not sure it is really. I think we have to beat our own intuition that this is in some ways surprising or difficult. And we have to untangle the statement that China has a lot of power with the expectations we traditionally have for what a dominant power is, right? The roles and responsibilities that America has sort of lived with and chosen to use over the past 100 years are not necessarily what it means to be a dominant power. It is the case that China is not proactive in the way America was. It is the case it doesn't have a holistic foreign policy in the way in which America imagines itself, right? And that can be frustrating to us on issues like global warming. But that does not mean that China is not a world power. It shouldn't be surprising that the country with the world's largest economy in the globalized market economy we live in has a huge amount of power. It's just more passive. So passive that in many ways in the West we have missed the signs. So to end, I'd like to look at the West Africa example brought earlier, the flight from Nairobi to Accra. It shouldn't be surprising to us that Chinese was on the map. If we think about the things that we all know about that part of the world, that Ghana does have a huge amount of investment from China, we shouldn't be surprised to learn that the Chinese language is one which is regularly used. Yet it is surprising to us because we take China's isolationism in terms of trying to not copy America as meaning that it doesn't therefore project any power at all. And so what I'd like to do really, when you're voting, is to try and confound your own intuitions and actually think about what it means to be a dominant power and consider not looking at it from sort of the view of students sitting in Coventry, but sort of more wide, taking a sort of a wider viewpoint. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for very interesting comments there, which I'm not sure how many are on our side, how many are on the other side of the House. But let me very briefly, I agree, and straight up what's just been said is absolutely in line with what I was saying at the beginning, which is that I think the notion of dominance of one country being, and remember the notion, it was being the dominant power in the world, no longer makes sense in the world today, and I'm not sure quite what dominance means. So that's one reason I would ask you to vote against the motion. If we do look in old-fashioned terms, just imagine this. If, for some reason, let us say, there was a new Cold War turning towards a hot war, if the United States fleet chose to blockade the Malacca Straits of Singapore, which it is quite capable of doing, that would choke off the Chinese economy within a month or two. It would no longer be receiving iron ore, copper, oil, or all the other things it needs to keep going. Now, however we define dominance, you're not a dominant world power if you could be subject to such a constraint there. And then looking internally in China, there is a fundamental contradiction, which I refer to, between the maintenance of one-party communist power, which is the reason Deng Xiaoping started economic growth in the first place, to make China a great power and to keep the Communist Party there after all the destruction done to it during the Cultural Revolution. That is the bottom line. But at the same time, last November, the Communist Party committed itself to economic reform, which it needs to retain that economic momentum. And the two are in fundamental contradiction. Just two quotes from that pleaded document, and I won't overrun my time. It said, "We will harness the forces, the dynamism of the market to reform and modernize the economy." Read down a little further, and it says, "The purpose of reform is to increase the dominance of the party state." Those, to me, are two incompatible issues which will come to a conflict at some time. It doesn't mean China will collapse, but it means that China doesn't have the desire for dominance, there's not the possibility for dominance, and internally it will be held back from that. And if I might say, and I haven't been on airlines in Africa, but I think one reason that announcements are made in Chinese is there are an awful lot of Chinese flying on those airlines. Thank you.
Thanks very much. 4 points. If US took off the Malacca Strait, that if is a huge if. America doesn't have the capability and capacity to do so because China holds 8% of stock of US Treasury. The retaliation that you can imagine from that sort of offensive activity is enormous. It's not quite possible. And talking about intention is always a difficult thing. You can never interview Xi Jinping and say, do you actually want to dominate the world? You can never do that. So it's really difficult to talk about the dominance from the perspective of Chinese intention. At the moment, the situation tells us that China wants to develop economically further, and that's the most important aim for the Chinese Communist Party. So from that perspective, China doesn't care about how to dominate the world at the moment. But then, as the economic power increases, you never know. My strong point of this of our party is that we still have 86 years to go to tell this answer. So I would say that not now, but in 30 years' time, I think when China has enough capability, then hegemonic theory would tell you that China will inevitably want to become dominant power. Internal problems, it is a significant problem that China has. However, we're talking about China as a country at the moment. We're not talking about sort of diversity within China, which itself is an important issue. But in terms of this debate, China is regarded as a country. Internal issue is not really important. I will leave it there. Thanks.
I'd like to thank all our speakers for what I hope has been an exciting, enjoyable debate for everyone. Before we go, we're going to do a quick vote. On the motion that this House believes that China will be the dominant power in the world century, the motion fails. We'd like to thank all our speakers, a massive round of applause. On a personal note, I would like to thank the WDU committee for putting up with my Facebook messages at midnight, the WDS exec for being very accommodating, and all of you for coming. We hope you come to our next debate, which will be on the 30th of October, on a motion that will be announced on our Facebook page later tonight.